Canada was on the verge of breaking up in the late fall of 1995. The Parti Québécois, led by Jacques Parizeau, presented the people of Quebec a referendum on whether they wanted to leave Canada or not. Though a similar referendum was soundly defeated 15 years earlier, this one was defeated by the narrowest of margins. But how did we get here? Today's video is about the birth and rise of the Parti Québécois, a party that advocates for an independent Quebec. We will start with the political state of things in Quebec in the 1950s and end at the 1995 referendum. I'll explain why I'm ending there specifically at the end of this video. Hello everyone, welcome to Election History. My name is Dave and I do videos about the history of elections, campaigns, political parties, candidates, and so on. And today we are going to be talking about the Parti Québécois in Quebec. So if these are the type of videos you like, please go ahead and subscribe to the channel, like the video if you like it, and comment below about any other types of elections that I should be looking at internationally. I live in the United States, but if there are any other elections, please go ahead and put them down below. Now, this is a topic that is very close to me. So that's my master's degree there from McGill University. It's focused on Canadian voting behavior. And that's what I studied at McGill, focused on Quebec voting behavior. And you can actually see my thesis that's focused on Quebec voting behavior in the National Assembly's library in Quebec City. So go ahead and check that out. Now, before we continue, I want to thank all my subscribers, but I'd like to give a special thanks to my Patreon members and my YouTube members. It's their support that helps this channel go. Each of my videos, and I try to get one out each week, take between 25 and possibly 40 hours with the research, the editing, the gathering of video clips, pictures, and all that. So it does take a long time. It's like a second full-time job. So if you want to help out the channel in any way and become a member, please do so today. The link for Patreon is down below. And these are the Patreon members and YouTube members that I have right now. So thank you all for your help. So with that, let's go ahead and get into the video. To start this video, we're going back 10 years before the Parti Québécois was founded and to the government of Maurice Duplessis. Duplessis was the premier of Quebec twice between 1936 and 1939 and 1944 until his death on September 7th, 1959. According to author Darcy Jenish, there were three pillars when it came to Duplessis' reign. The first was tied to ancestral traditions, the second was to the French language, and the third was to the Catholic Church. In the late 1950s, a lot of Quebec was rural, though Montreal and Quebec City were increasing in importance. These three important pillars allowed Duplessis to stay in power, as he could always count on those in rural Canada, who called him le chef, or the boss in English, to continue to vote for his party, the Union Nationale. Though in the larger cities, especially Montreal, the Liberal Party would usually dominate. With Duplessis' electoral success came real power. With that, he sought to control businesses that operated in Quebec. Duplessis was strongly anti-union and backed businesses when workers went on strike. One of those strikes was in 1949 when the workers of Asbestos, Quebec, yes, the name of the town came first, and then the name for the asbestos came from that town's name, they decided to go on strike. Most of their demands were based on modest pay increases, social safety net increases, increased overtime pay, and the removal of asbestos particles from the area, a danger that we in the 21st century know all too well. And with this strike, we started to see cracks in some of Duplessis' pillars for success. First, with the mining companies being American, thus English-speaking, many Francophones backed the strikers. Second, the Catholic Church, which always had Duplessis' back, really didn't this time. The Archbishop of Montreal, Joseph Charbonneau, asked the people to help and donate to the strikers, presenting even more problems for Duplessis. Another person who had joined the strikers was a young Pierre Elliott Trudeau, but we will get back to him later. Not only did the strikers stop working, but they blocked the entrance to the mines as well. These blockades were violently broken up by either the police under the control of Duplessis or by temporary workers, or scabs, that came in to replace the striking workers. The workers eventually ended their strike with very little compensation and basically a return to the status quo. The strike also showed another problem that most in Quebec had already known, which was that Duplessis' government favored companies from English speaking Canada and the United States over those from Quebec. Yes, Duplessis was very nationalistic when it came to traditions and language, but was also working with the English speaking companies many times for his own financial gains. Bribery. Of course, this presented the obvious problems with corruption, but it also presented a problem in the workplace. See, many of those who held management positions in companies were either from English speaking Canada or French speakers who were fluent in English. Therefore, in order to advance in any company and particularly into management, one needed to know English. This was very difficult as only 29% of those in Quebec were bilingual in the 1950s. This language division also created a class separation, with Anglophones usually making significantly more money than the Francophones. Oh, and it should be mentioned here that there were a lot of Anglophones working in management who didn't know French at all, yet most of the workforce that worked under that management spoke almost entirely French. So this became a brewing problem. While the 1950s would be a time of increased tension, it was also a time of great advancement, especially when it came to the television. Between 1956 and 1959, many around Quebec tuned into Radio Canada to watch Point de Mire, a show hosted by René Levesque, a former World War II correspondent who would explain events in Canada and throughout the world using simple explanations. Not only did this make René Levesque a household name throughout the province, but also showed how other provinces were advancing while Quebec was being left behind. After World War II, Quebec's economy actually did slightly better than the rest of Canada, but by the time the 1950s came along, Quebec had fallen behind the other provinces, mostly because it didn't want to work with the federal government or other provinces, thus missing out on federal funding to help expand their economy. But on September 7th, 1959, things changed. Duplessis died from a series of strokes. He would be replaced by Paul Sauvé, who said that he would break from Duplessis' era, but essentially continued most of his policies. However, this didn't last for long because Sauvé keeled over less than 4 months later on January 2nd, 1960. His replacement, Antonio Barrette, called for an election to be held on June 22nd, 1960. As for the Union Nationale, the party was in total chaos, being on its third leader, thus the third premier of Quebec, in less than 4 months. As for the Liberal Party, the only real competition in this election, party leader Jean Lesage had been talking about the corruption that had been happening under Duplessis' regime. But Lesage's liberals were more than just talking about the misdeeds of the Union Nationale. They wanted to lessen the impact, or maybe even destroy the influence, of one of the pillars that led to Duplessis' success. They wanted to move Quebec toward a more secular society. During Duplessis' time in office, the Catholic Church was essentially controlling the education system. This not only caused a problem of church as well as political indoctrination, but many students who attended church run schools were poorly prepared to attend colleges and universities. Lesage wanted to take education out of the hands of the church and place it in the hands of the state. With this, the Liberal Party's campaign message was to modernize Quebec. Along with education, the party wanted to reform healthcare, the provincial welfare state, and promote Francophone economic mobility. One of the people who was brought in to promote this modernization was Radio Canada's René Levesque. Prior to 1958, Levesque was not known to be particularly political. But in late December of 1958, Radio Canada's producers went on strike, demanding that they should be allowed to form a union. Levesque, who had not been active in supporting the strikers once the strike started, was convinced by union leader Jean Marchand to join in the struggle. As Gerard Pelletier would say years later, once Levesque was convinced of the cause, it became an obsession for him. After the strike had gone on for nearly 2 months, Marchand, Pelletier, Lévesque, and Trudeau went to Ottawa to see if the government of John Diefenbaker would intervene in the strike, but they wouldn't. After this failure, Marchand recommended that there should be a press conference, which the topic should be about the unfair treatment of Quebec. After all, the rest of Canada was receiving live television while Quebec was not. And in this press conference, we saw the birth of the Parti Québécois. While talking about the strike, René Lévesque spoke more about the way that Quebec was being treated as inferior to the rest of Canada and that those leaders in Ottawa looked down on Quebec. Essentially, Lévesque moved from being an interested observer to a strong nationalist within a few months. On March 2nd, 1959, Lévesque would be arrested with a number of other protesters in Montreal for not having a parade permit. With the Liberal Party being the Change Party and star candidate René Lévesque on their side, Lesage's Liberals won 51.4% of the popular vote and 52 seats, giving the Liberals a majority. However, from the outset, there was contention. Lévesque wanted to consolidate and nationalize Quebec's electricity, which was controlled by a number of companies throughout the province, into Hydro-Quebec, established under the last Liberal government in 1944 when it nationalized Montreal Light, Heat, and Power. Lesage's government was divided on whether they should go through with it, but Lesage decided to go ahead. To see if the issue of nationalization was popular, Lesage called for a snap election, making the nationalization issue the single issue that dominated the election, with the campaign slogan being Masters of Our Own House, signifying that Quebec had both the right and ability to handle many of its own affairs without the interference of Ottawa or companies from outside of Quebec. This also increased René Lévesque's profile as well, with the election called and the Union Nationale still being the only real opposition and they were still in disarray. The Liberals easily won the 1962 election, increasing their popular vote to 56.4%, winning 63 seats. At this point, we can really split Quebec politics into 5 distinct camps. The first camp were those who supported a strong connection to Canada, which opposed greater autonomy within the province. The person who would become the prominent leader of this camp was Pierre Elliott Trudeau. The second camp would be those who supported a greater level of autonomy for Quebec and distancing the province from Ottawa, yet still being part of the Canadian Federation and not advocating for an independent Quebec. After the 1962 election, René Lévesque would fall into this camp, with Jean Lesage probably floating between these two camps. The third camp were those in the Union Nationale, which supported the 3 pillars that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. At this point, the party was led by Daniel Johnson Sr., who was advocating a policy of equality or independence. Johnson could also be seen as the first who treated Quebec as a nation instead of a province. Still, though flirting with independence, he still wanted to keep the 3 pillars intact. The fourth option were the full-fledged separatists, split into 2 primary parties. The first was the REN, or the Rally for National Independence. When the party started off, it was primarily focused purely on the independence of Quebec without much in the way of ideology. But when the party elected Pierre Bourgault on March 31st, 1964, by a vote of 125 to 85, the party took a leftward turn, with some in the organization even advocating for revolution, especially amongst its younger members. Other members, particularly from the eastern townships of Quebec, left the party to start the National Rally, a more center-right party on both fiscal and social issues, with its first president being Gilles Grégoire. Even before Bourgault became leader, a number of young members thought that the political process was ineffective and too slow. They would form the 5th group, those who sought violence and sabotage as their means to political ends, or terrorist. Several members of the REN's youth wing, which was involved in petty vandalism previously, were inspired by the revolutions happening in Cuba and Africa. As a result, the Liberation Front of Quebec, or the FLQ, was born. However, in 1966, there was an election to be held. scheduled for June 5th, 1966. Prior to the election, the federal government had announced the rollout of Medicare, which many assumed would put a huge tax burden on the provinces. This helped those who had been advocating for independence, or at least greater autonomy for Quebec. While Lévesque was being pushed in the direction of independence, the Liberals' official party stance was still federalist. But the Union Nationale was open to independence, and there were two other parties that supported full independence, both on the left and the right. Another factor to play in this race was that the voting age was lowered from 18 to 21, and those under the age of 24 hadn't voted for the Liberals in the past and were more likely to support one of the parties that was advocating for independence. This caused a split in the vote that wasn't expected. The Liberals would win the plurality of the vote with 47.3%, but the Union Nationale would win the most seats at 56 seats, obtaining a majority by a mere one seat, with only 40.8% of the vote, which was 6.5% less than the Liberals. The REN under Pierre Bourgault won no seats but 5.6% of the vote, and the National Rally of Gilles Gregoire won 3.2% of the vote, but also with no seats. While Lévesque did win re-election in his riding of Laurier, he no longer had the restraints of a ministerial position and was freer to say what he wanted. The next year, in 1967, a series of events would take place that would start René Lévesque's journey to being the most recognizable separatist in the history of Quebec. On July 24th, 1967, French President Charles de Gaulle was visiting Montreal to visit Expo 67. When giving a speech from City Hall, he uttered these famous words.
Et je puis vous dire qu'elle en vaudra mieux. Vive Montréal, vive le Québec. Vive le Québec libre.
The Canadian government was outraged as it saw de Gaulle as interfering in Canadian internal affairs. As for those who supported separation, this was welcome as it appeared that the French president supported Quebec independence. A few months later, on September 18, 1967, Lévesque presented his ideas of what he would eventually call Sovereignty Association, which would create an independent Quebec, but within an economic partnership with Canada. This was the first time that Lévesque made his views known publicly. He also felt that the Liberal Party didn't have a future unless it changed to a sovereigntist position. In October, at the Liberal Party of Quebec's conference, Lévesque presented his manifesto to the conference for a vote. He said he would quit the party if he didn't receive 25% of the vote. However, the Liberal Party already intended to remove Lévesque from the party if he lost the votes. A clear majority wanted Lévesque out of the party, and that's what they got. The motion to accept his manifesto failed, and he resigned before the Liberals could boot him out. After leaving the Liberals, Lévesque refused to join the REN or the National Rally, instead starting the Sovereignty Association movement, or MSA, with former members of the Liberal Party who had quit with Lévesque at the party conference. On November 19, 1967, the MSA officially formed with 380 members attending the two-day meeting. Lévesque said that the MSA was only to be temporary, with the goal of establishing a political party by April of 1968. However, it would take a few months more. On October 11, 1968, the MSA officially voted to become the Parti Québécois, or PQ. There was some contention in the meeting when hardline Francophones opposed Lévesque's proposal to preserve English language schools, with hardliners demanding a French-only policy. Lévesque's position won and became part of the official platform. A few days later, Gilles Gregoire, the leader of the National Rally, encouraged his members to become members of the Parti Québécois on October 14th. Gregoire became the PQ's vice president, and the National Rally dissolved. 12 days later, after the dissolution of the National Rally, the REN was also dissolved. But former members of the REN could only join one member at a time because of the violent reputation that they had received. The goal of Parti Québécois in their first election was not to win, but to simply hold the balance of power and possibly to play kingmaker. But there were a few changes during and after the formation of the Parti Québécois. Daniel Johnson, keeping within the tradition of the Union Nationale, died while in office on September 26, 1968. Jean-Jacques Bertrand replaced Johnson. Bertrand's government passed Bill 63, allowing parents to pick which language their children were taught in. See, the school system hadn't been totally secularized yet, and basically children who went to Catholic schools usually spoke French, and English-speaking students went to Protestant schools where the instruction was in English. However, the increase in allophone students, those who didn't speak either French or English as their first language, presented a problem. Many of those students were from Italian families, which were predominantly Catholic. However, many families with an Italian background preferred their children to speak English instead of French. As a result, this would increase English instruction in Catholic schools, but Protestant schools essentially had no change whatsoever. This led to a large number of education protests throughout the province by Francophone parents, which also led to the Union Nationale government being extremely unpopular. On the Liberal side, Jean Lesage resigned as the leader of the party and was replaced by Robert Bourassa. Now, it will forever be debated whether Bourassa was a closet sovereigntist or not, but suffice to say that he was more open to the grievances of those in the sovereignty movement. Still, it was a good move for both. Lesage wanted to leave politics and be more involved with businesses and organizations. Interestingly, he was the first president of the WHL team, the Quebec Nordiques, who would go on to win 3 Stanley Cups as the Colorado Avalanche. As for Bourassa, he was considered a safe, moderate choice and was young, being only 36 years old at the time of the 1970 election. Oh, and there was also a social credit party that was competing at the provincial level in Quebec, but it would take forever to explain them. And since this is a video about the Parti Québécois, check out this video regarding social credit on JJ McAuliffe's channel. It's a good basic review of the whole movement. Going into the campaign, it was anyone's guess who would win. A poll conducted by La Presse showed the Liberals in the lead with 24% support, with the Parti Québécois at 19%. Both Social Credit and the Union Nationale were at 10% each, with 20% of voters still undecided. By the time the 1970 election came on April 29, 1970, the Liberal Party won the most seats, winning a majority government with 72 seats, but also saw a decrease in votes, finishing with 45.4%. The Parti Québécois finished second in the popular vote with 23.1%, but only won 7 seats, with Lévesque losing his own seat. The Union Nationale only won 17 seats with 19.7% of the vote, and they would never hold government again. The social credit candidates won 11.2% of the vote with 12 seats. So even though the Parti Québécois was the second best political party as far as overall votes, they were 4th in seats. Their strength was on the east side of the island of Montreal and some scattered ridings throughout the province. While this could be considered an electoral victory for the Parti Québécois, showing popular support, it was also a defeat, and they didn't have enough power in the National Assembly in order to make changes. This unfortunately led to those in the FLQ, those who resorted to violence that I mentioned earlier, to see democracy as a futile effort and step up their terrorist efforts. This all came to a head in October of 1970 when British Trade Representative James Cross and Minister of Labour Pierre Laporte were kidnapped from their homes by the FLQ. This led to the government, now under the leadership of Pierre Trudeau, allowing authorities in both Quebec and Montreal to invoke parts of the War Measures Act, mainly allowing the authorities to conduct mass arrests without warrants. One day after the mass arrest on October 17, 1970, Pierre Laporte is executed by strangulation. James Cross would be released, but not until December 3rd. This would be known as the October Crisis. Now, to get into the October crisis would take too much time, and this video is focused on the Parti Québécois and not the October crisis. If you want to watch a great documentary about it, check out Action, the October crisis of 1970. That's on the National Film Board of Canada's website. I'll put the link down below. Immediately after the murder of Pierre Laporte, René Lévesque condemned the murder and the FLQ. However, there was a problem. While Lévesque thought that the condemnation of the FLQ would show a clear separation between his party and the violence of the FLQ, it also connected violence to the sovereignty movement. Lévesque even admitted that some bad apples from the REN might have been involved with both the Parti Québécois and the FLQ. Still, Lévesque attacked Pierre Trudeau and Robert Bourassa for what he saw as overkill by invoking the War Measures Act to deal with the crisis. And this is where I want to make a point. A lot of Quebec historians, and I would even say revisionist historians, treat the invoking of the War Measures Act as something that was unpopular. The reason for this is that much of the history that has been written about the October crisis has been from those who usually view the crisis from a lens that is favorable to the sovereigntist movement. This is a similar problem that we have in the United States with a lot of Civil War historians trying to create a revisionist view of the Confederacy's political history. However, a poll conducted by Gallup released on December 12th, just 9 days after the release of James Richard Cross, 86% of French-speaking Canadians supported the actions that Bourassa and Trudeau had taken. Yes, this is throughout Canada, but with 85% of Canada's French-speaking population being in Quebec, this number shows an absolutely large majority of those in Quebec supported invoking the War Measures Act. So I just wanted to make that point known. Now, Robert Bourassa was a problem for the Parti Québécois for a few reasons. First, as I just mentioned, he was looked at favorably regarding the handling of the October crisis. However, he also started moving forward on projects that were approved during the Lesage government that had also been delayed during the Union Nationale government, especially when it came to electricity and education, things that René Lévesque initially got the ball rolling on. When it came to federal-provincial relations, he always stated that he was a federalist but would do as much as he could to push provincial rights and not put Quebec in a position of disadvantage. When it came to language, Bourassa wanted to strike a balance between French and English-speaking parts of Quebec. This would eventually change years later, but just know that this was Bourassa's view in the early 1970s. Because of this, the Parti Québécois were painted as a separatist party who were more focused on language and ethnic purity, even if this wasn't the case. It should be noted, as I hinted a little bit before, that Lévesque was someone who didn't want to alienate English-speaking Quebecers, but the party was painted this way nonetheless. With Bourassa's popularity high, he decided to call an election, which would be held on October 29, 1973. Bourassa had his own policy based on what I just mentioned previously, while the Parti Québécois was making an argument that the economic independence of Quebec was vitally important for the survival of the province, and the only way to achieve that was through political separation from Canada. The chief architect of the Parti Québécois' economic plan was Jacques Parizeau, a well-known economist at the time who produced the budget for an independent Quebec. While many argued that the budget could be sensible, it was also far-fetched since it hinged on the idea of an independent Quebec. As a result, the Liberals dominated the 1973 election, Bourassa's Liberals winning 54.7% of the vote and 102 seats, which was the largest majority in Quebec's history. While the Parti Québécois dropped a seat, now only having 6 seats, and René Lévesque again losing his own seat, the party gained 7.2% on their popular vote total from 1970, now at 30.2%. Social Credit took a nosedive with only 2 seats. The Union Nationale was completely wiped out, losing all of their seats and only receiving 4.9% of the vote. But after the election, things would turn sour for the Liberals. First, Bourassa's government implement Bill 22, which would make French the official language of Quebec, thus making it the only language used in offices with official capacities. While federal law protected the use of English in Quebec at that time, something that would change years later, it was still seen as an attack on the English speaking community. But there was more. In March of 1974, there was a riot by the construction workers working on the James Bay project, one of the largest hydroelectric projects in Canada. It was expected that the leaders of the union were trying to extort more money from Bourassa's government, thus using violent tactics to get the government to act. Because the acts were covered in the news, Bourassa had no choice but to form a commission to look into the highly publicized riot. To take the helm of this commission was Robert Clich, a highly respected provincial judge. Also included in his commission were lawyers Guy Cheverett, Lucien Bouchard, and Brian Mulroney. As the investigation progressed, it was apparent that Bourassa's cabinet was highly involved in corruption. Lucien Bouchard wanted Bourassa to testify, but Brian Mulroney said that he shouldn't. The report, which was released in May of 1975, said that corruption in the unions was primarily allowed because of corruption in the government, which took a blind eye to the union's corrupt actions, with Bourassa's government being directly involved. Bourassa's popularity took a huge hit and continued to plummet over the next year. An election was called to take place on November 15th, 1976. While Bourassa's popularity took a hit, the Parti Québécois changed directions as well. Independence would no longer be the focal point of the campaign. The campaign would focus more on good governance. See, this was the perfect time for Lévesque and his party, with all the other parties being wounded. If the Parti Québécois focused on independence, then it might snatch defeat out of the jaws of victory. Therefore, Lévesque knew that there needed to be a change. Not only did he talk about good governance, but also slammed the Liberal Party and Robert Bourassa regarding the Clich Commission's reports. Another thing which might have clinched the deal for Lévesque is saying that the issue of Quebec independence would only be solved through a referendum. Previously, many worried that if the Parti Québécois controlled the National Assembly, they would declare independence through parliamentary means. This referendum approach allowed the people to vote for the Parti Québécois and not worry about Quebec immediately separating from Canada. On election night, the Parti Québécois won, winning 71 seats with 58 being required for a majority. They also won 41.4% of the popular vote, way ahead of everybody else. The last seat was held by Fabien Roy of the newly formed National People's Party. This time, René Lévesque won his riding and thus became the Premier of Quebec. But just a few months after winning the election, Lévesque hit a man while driving his secretary's car, fatally injuring the man. According to some, Lévesque had considered resigning, but those in the party convinced him to stay on as it was just deemed an accident. As premier, he had told others in Canada and Quebec that he wasn't going to head into independence immediately, keeping his pledge during the campaign. However, one point where he made a drastic U-turn was on language policy. The Parti Québécois passed Bill 101 in the National Assembly, making French the only official language in the province, requiring all civil servants to know French as well. This was much harsher than previous bills, which allowed English even if in a restricted capacity. There were some constitutional challenges to the bill, but for the most part, Quebec society would shift over to French. Whether Lévesque, who had strongly advocated for equal treatment of English minorities in the past, supported Bill 101, or if he was just forced by hardline ethnic nationalists in his party, we will never know. Still, Bill 101 became the law of the land and is still fiercely debated today. Other than that, Lévesque's government didn't rock the boat that much when it came to the affairs of the province, basically providing the good governance that he had promised with one of the most highly educated cabinets in Canadian history. However, Lévesque and his party were ramping up for a referendum on sovereignty. The timing and structure of the referendum was important. First, let's look at the timing. On May 22, 1979, Conservatives, under Joe Clark, won a minority government in the federal elections. Since Pierre Trudeau and the Liberals were Lévesque's biggest rivals and no longer in government, the Parti Québécois thought that this would be the best time for a referendum. All right, so editing Dave here in the middle of the video. Just want to make a few points. The first one, if you haven't subscribed yet and you like the video so far, go ahead and subscribe and like the video. The second thing I want to mention is because someone will mention it throughout the video, I keep on saying at the federal level, the Conservative Party. I keep on saying the Conservatives of Joe Clark or Brian Mulroney. I know it's the Progressive Conservatives. I just forgot to say progressive. The reason I say that is because someone down in the comments will say, you forgot to say Progressive Conservatives. They went, I know. All right, let's get back to the video. Also, since Trudeau, a Quebecer himself, was replaced by Clark, who was from Alberta, it came across to many in Quebec as a rejection of a francophone prime minister by English-speaking Canada. As far as the structure, Lévesque went with the Sovereignty Association concept he supported earlier instead of a full break from Canada. He also supported a two-referendum approach, with the first referendum question asking the voters of Quebec to allow the provincial government to negotiate with the Canadian government to become independent, and then a second referendum to approve what had been negotiated. The complex referendum question was introduced to the public on December 20th, 1979. However, between the referendum announcement and the actual vote, which was to take place on May 20th, 1980, the minority Clark government collapsed and Pierre Trudeau became prime minister yet again on February 18th, 1980. This killed the argument that French Canada rejected Quebec. With that, the focus of the campaign totally shifted, with Trudeau confidant Jean Chrétien taking the battle to Lévesque, making a passionate populist argument about the survival of Canada. As for the Parti Québécois, their campaign was more technocratic, as Claude Morin, the intergovernmental affairs minister who had been the architect of both the question and the timing of the referendum, he would say this.
For some reason, we made what I would call a black and white electoral campaign, while the opponents made a technicolor one.
And let me throw this in yet again. This video is not about the 1980 or the 1995 referendums. This is about the Parti Québécois. I think that those referendums need to be looked at in much greater detail. If you want to get a look at the 1980 referendum, then I recommend watching the Champions series from the National Film Board of Canada. And for the 1995 referendum, I recommend The Breaking Point by the CBC, which is available here on YouTube. I'll put both links down below. But suffice to say, the referendum was voted down with only 40.4% of voters voting for the referendum. In 1981, Quebec was heading into another election year. With the referendum over and the Parti Québécois knowing that it probably wasn't going to pass anyway, Lévesque's position as leader wasn't threatened by anyone in the party. But the Parti Québécois, who was still wounded nonetheless, received a blessing in disguise when Pierre Trudeau called for a discussion about a Canadian constitution. See, Canada at this time didn't have a constitution, and Trudeau wanted to make that a reality. In a nutshell, Trudeau wanted to have a strong federal government with much of the power centralized in Ottawa, and Lévesque wanted to decentralize federalism with more power to the provinces. Luckily for Lévesque, premiers from the other provinces also agreed with him, as Trudeau's view on federalism would also strip their provinces of power as well. Many in Quebec saw this as encroachment by Ottawa and helped the Parti Québécois revitalize after the referendum defeat. But there was another thing as well. Quebec Liberal leader Claude Ryan was, to put it nicely, an extremely dull and boring guy. René Lévesque was personally popular, even if his views were controversial. The Parti Québécois would win the 1981 election, winning 49.3% of the vote, adding 9 seats to their majority, giving them 80 seats total. Still, the Liberals did gain 12.3% on their previous results, finishing with 46.1% of the vote and gaining 16 seats. Quebec had truly become a two-party province. The Union Nationale was finished, winning only 4% of the vote and no seats. Social Credit was absolutely destroyed, winning only 0.04 of the vote and losing their one seat. Interestingly enough, Fabien Roy, who won the seat for Social Credit back in 1976, was elected to the federal parliament in 1979. It was his inaction as leader of the Social Credit Party which led to the collapse of the Clark government. Even with the win, the federal government and the provinces got together to discuss a Canadian constitution again. Things hadn't changed, with the provinces wanting to have more control over their affairs. However, many thought that Lévesque, coming off a huge electoral win, would reject any constitution because it was not in his interest to support a constitution, and it probably wouldn't hurt him politically. But Trudeau approached Lévesque with a proposition that some of the basic principles of the Constitution, where there was agreement with Quebec and the federal government, would be brought to a referendum. However, the other provinces did not want to go through a referendum. Lévesque, assuming that he had a deal with Trudeau, didn't know that Jean Chrétien had been talking to other premiers about an alternative which they could all agree upon and which would avoid any referendums. It would also mean keeping Quebec out of the loop. As a result, the Constitution, which would eventually become the Constitution Act of 1982, was agreed to by the federal government and the provincial governments, except Quebec. Those in Quebec saw this as a stab in the back to Quebec, with some calling it political genocide. One would assume that this would help René Lévesque being able to play victim due to the federal government overreach, with English Canada teaming up to stomp out Quebec. But that wasn't the case, because Lévesque had publicly announced an agreement with Trudeau, which would eventually be rejected. Many saw Lévesque as easily being played. But this also harked back to a time when some in the sovereignty movement, mostly those in the FLQ, thought that political change would not work. At the Parti Québécois' 1981 convention, Jacques, one of those involved in the murder of Pierre Laporte, was given a standing ovation when addressing the convention, with the Montreal Gazette saying that the convention applauded more for Rose than for Lévesque. Also, a large number of civil servants went on strike, mostly due to Lévesque failing to or poorly negotiating contracts with civil service workers, particularly teachers. The National Assembly passed Bill 111 by 64 to 35, which would force workers back or they could lose their jobs. Lévesque and his government had been seen as a friend to the unions, but some of those unions now saw Lévesque as the enemy, with many in Quebec seeing the government as authoritarian. The final blow to Lévesque was in late 1984. In 1983, when Quebecer Brian Mulroney was elected leader of the Federal Conservative Party, Lévesque spoke to Mulroney about the possibility of working out some deal with the Canadian Constitution, since Quebec hadn't approved it. After Mulroney's Conservatives won in the 1984 federal election, which saw the Conservatives win 58 of the 73 seats in Quebec, Lévesque told party members on November 19, 1984, that independence should be dropped from the party platform for the upcoming election in 1985. Most in the party, such as Justice Minister Pierre-Marc Johnson, said that it would be the best move and that independence would be political suicide. And yes, he is the son of former Premier Daniel Johnson, and he will not be the last Johnson from this family that we'll talk about. Others who were hardline on the independence issue, like Jacques Parizeau, disagreed strongly, believing that it was the core principle of the party. 4 days after the announcement, 6 members quit the National Assembly, including Finance Minister Jacques Parizeau and Minister of Social Affairs Camille Laurent. While a few more would leave the party in the National Assembly, the Parti Québécois wouldn't lose enough to lose a majority. All came to a head on January 19, 1985, at the party's convention. Lévesque introduced dropping independence as part of the party's platform. Those who left the National Assembly, like Parizeau and Laurent, were still members of the party in general and were present at the convention. The party went on to drop independence from its platform, and those who had walked out of the National Assembly a few months earlier walked out of the convention with over 400 of their supporters. They started talking about possibly starting their own political party, a flashback to what Lévesque had done with the Liberals back in 1967. But even though Lévesque got what he wanted, there were still questions as to whether he would be the best leader to take on the Liberals, now run by Robert Bourassa. Yes, the Liberals went back to Robert Bourassa again. Certain camps within the sovereignty movement were positioning to take over the party. Pierre Marc Johnson, who had been a supporter of Lévesque, started to position himself for the leadership, making himself appear as the natural successor to Lévesque. As for Lévesque, the by-elections to fill the seats of those who had recently resigned gave the Parti Québécois a wake-up call. The Liberal Party swept all of the former Parti Québécois seats, with Robert Bourassa winning in Bertrand, since he hadn't been a sitting member when he was elected again as party leader in 1983. Jacques Parizeau's riding saw a loss of 41% for the Parti Québécois. With these losses, talk intensified about picking a new party leader. However, some would say that the party should stay with Lévesque because nobody was strong enough to replace him. Where have I heard that story before? Anyway, on June 20th, just 15 days after the by-election losses at 11:30 p.m., Lévesque resigned as the president of the Parti Québécois. He would stay on as premier and leader of the party until the party selected a new leader, thus a new premier. Always the favorite from the beginning, Johnson would go on to win on September 29th, 1985, with 58.7% of the vote, with Pauline Marois being a distant second with 19.7%. What's interesting is that many who had high profiles in Lévesque's cabinet, like Parizeau and Laurent, didn't run for the position. Probably because they assumed that the Parti Québécois was broken and whoever led the party was headed to certain defeat. And if this is what they had thought, they weren't wrong. With Johnson now the leader, the party really only changed in leadership, but still carried the baggage of Lévesque that had accumulated over the last few years. As a result, the Liberal Party dominated the 1985 elections, winning 56% of the vote to the Parti Québécois' 38.7%. The Liberals would gain 57 seats, having a strong majority of 99 seats. Interestingly, Bourassa would lose re-election in the riding that he had won in the by-election. The Parti Québécois was down to now only 23 seats. On November 1st, 1987, René Lévesque would die of a massive heart attack. Marc-Pierre Johnson would stay on as leader until he resigned on November 10th, 1987. Between the 1985 and the 1989 elections, many hardliners opposed Johnson, disagreeing with his approach of continuing the policies of René Lévesque, especially on the issue of independence. He would be replaced by interim leader Guy Chevret, who would be replaced by Jacques Parizeau on March 18th, 1988. Parizeau's win was so insignificant that it was buried in the newspapers, not even becoming front-page news. With Parizeau, he promised to make a return to making independence the guiding light of the party, but the party was in shambles. After the 1985 loss and 2 years of essentially no work being done to rebuild the party, over 20 ridings in the province had no grassroots organization at all. The party's finances were $500,000 in the red, and the party membership numbers were stagnant. At the time that Jacques Parizeau took over the Parti Québécois, Premier Robert Bourassa was negotiating the Meech Lake Accord. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney had been working with Bourassa to get Quebec to come on board with the Constitution. Originally, Mulroney was going to work with Lévesque, but once the party infighting started, Mulroney said that he wouldn't work with Lévesque until the problems within the party were resolved. That never happened. Therefore, Mulroney waited for Bourassa, who was going to be the premier anyway. However, Bourassa had some pretty demanding requests. The 5 conditions that Bourassa laid out were the recognition of Quebec as a distinct society, a veto for Quebec in constitutional matters, Quebec's consultation in Supreme Court justices, allowing the province to control immigration in Quebec, and limits on federal spending. In a meeting at Meech Lake, there was an agreement on 4 of those points with some minor changes, with the veto being the only thing left out. Most in Quebec supported the accord, and it gave Quebec basically what it had asked for. Others opposed it for a number of reasons. Many outside of Quebec who opposed it said that treating Quebec as a distinct society gave the province a special status, meaning that Quebec would have more power in a federal system where each province should be treated equally. In order for the Meech Lake Accord to pass, all provincial legislatures had to accept the agreement. Once the first provincial legislature accepted the agreement, a 3-year clock would start for all others to accept it. Quebec started that clock on June 23, 1987. Between the time the clock started and eventually ended, which would be on June 22, 1990, there was an election in Quebec. The Parti Québécois was still trying to rebuild the party, and since the party agreed with Bourassa's government regarding Meech Lake, there really wasn't much of a difference on those issues. The PQ only gained 1.5% of the popular vote since their 1985 trouncing, now at 29 seats. However, the Liberals did lose 6% of the vote and 7 seats. Most of the loss came from the Equality Party, a party focused on the rights of Anglophones who saw both Bourassa and the Parti Québécois as trying to eliminate the English language from Quebec. They won 3.7% of the vote and 4 seats on the island of Montreal. But back to the Meech Lake Accord. Now, as I said before, this is about the Parti Québécois, not the Constitution of Canada. Therefore, I'm not going to go deep into Meech Lake, though it is very important to the history of Canada and Quebec. But in May of 1990, 3 provinces had yet to accept it, though Newfoundland had accepted it and then revoked their acceptance. Many argued that the Distinct Society Clause was the main problem as it could weaken minority language rights. As a result, an addition to the accord was recommended, saying that the issues of language should still adhere to Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Essentially, this would challenge the language laws in Quebec. Bourassa, Parizeau, and others in Quebec strongly oppose these additions to the agreement. One day after the announcement, Quebec Tory MP Francois Guérin quit the party and became an independent, supporting the idea of sovereignty association. On May 21st, Lucien Bouchard resigns from Mulroney's cabinet and the Progressive Conservative Party and comes out in support of Quebec's sovereignty. After some changes to the accord, which Bourassa accepted, Parizeau said that Bourassa should be considered a sellout if he didn't stick to the original 5 points that he had mentioned earlier. Still, the Meech Lake Accord wasn't just in the hands of Quebec, but other provinces as well. In fact, the future of the accord was in the hands of just one man, but nobody knew it yet. Elijah Harper, an Indigenous MLA from Manitoba, would derail the entire process. Requiring unanimous consent to start debate on the accord in the Manitoba legislature, Harper continued to vote against opening debate, symbolically holding up a single eagle feather, criticizing that the Indigenous communities should be considered as distinct societies in the same way that Quebec was treated. Once the debate eventually opened, the clock ran out to approve the accord. Time could only be extended to take a vote, but that had to be done by unanimous consent as well. Harper refused to extend debate, and the accord was dead. Knowing that Manitoba wasn't going to approve the accord, Newfoundland also shut down debate. Seen as another rejection of Quebec, nationalism rose in Quebec. The Jean-Baptiste Day March in Montreal saw 500,000 people take to the streets, waving Quebec flags. However, the mood in Quebec had been changing even before the Meech Lake Accord died. In May, after the changes that were proposed by the other provinces, which infuriated Bourassa and Parizeau and led Bouchard leaving his own party, 60% of Quebecers said that they would vote in favor of a sovereignty association referendum. After the collapse of Meech Lake, a commission was set up by the Quebec government called the Bélanger-Campeau Commission to determine the future of Quebec. The commission suggested that a referendum on sovereignty should be placed on the ballot no later than 1992. As a result, Bourassa introduced Bill 150, which would call for a referendum on sovereignty, but was actually opposed by the Parti Québécois because they felt that Bourassa wouldn't hold to the referendum. They were right. Instead, the referendum was on the Charlottetown Accord. Okay, so what's the Charlottetown Accord? Well, it's basically like the Meech Lake Accord, but added Aboriginal self-governance, which would now be constitutional, the Canada Clause, which was similar to what Quebec sought with the Distinct Society Clause, but also included a number of other provisions to protect minorities, the clarification of federalism by defining certain sectors that were within the purview of provincial governments, social change, such as supporting universal healthcare, and a number of other institutions in Canada, as well as Senate reform. According to Jacques Parizeau and Lucien Bouchard, who is now leader of the newly formed Bloc Québécois, a federal political party that supported sovereignty, what was offered in Charlottetown was less than what was offered in Meech Lake, as they felt that it weakened Quebec's position. This also reflected badly on Robert Bourassa, who was the chief negotiator for Quebec in Charlottetown, but didn't adhere to the conditions that he himself set out regarding Meech Lake. Basically, he was seen as caving in on his earlier promises. Unlike Meech Lake, Charlottetown was decided by a national referendum instead of by legislatures. They didn't want the agreement to be in the hands of just a few people. The referendum failed with a no vote of 56.7% in Quebec. Bourassa would continue as premier, passing an unpopular sales tax as well as a number of unpopular pieces of legislation. But due to illness, Bourassa would resign as party leader in December of 1993 and as premier in 1994. He would die of skin cancer in 1996. The new Liberal premier of Quebec was Daniel Johnson Jr. Yes, he's the son of Daniel Johnson Sr. of the Union Nationale and the brother of Pierre-Marc Johnson of the Parti Québécois. All three were premiers, all three with different parties. I told you that we weren't finished talking about the Johnson family. 1994 was an election year, with the Quebec provincial election being held on September 12th. Before the provincial election, the federal election was held in October of 1993, with Lucien Bouchard's Bloc Québécois winning almost half of the votes in Quebec, as well as 54 seats in the parliament, which made the Bloc the official opposition in Ottawa. Therefore, things were looking good for the Parti Québécois. The Bloc had done well, the Liberals botched both Meech Lake and Charlottetown, as well as passed a number of policies that people didn't like. And with the Liberals being in power for 9 years, the Parti Québécois presented the voters with a change in direction. It seemed to be a perfect storm for the Parti Québécois. However, the winds had been changing in Quebec. Unlike after the Meech Lake Accord, Quebec voters started to cool when it came to independence. While the Parti Québécois was heading toward a majority government, according to the polls, 55% of voters in Quebec would vote no on a Sovereignty Association referendum, with only 42% voting yes amongst Francophone voters. Still, Parizeau was always known as a hardliner and let people know that a vote for the Parti Québécois was a vote for another referendum. When Election Day rolled around in 1994, the Parti Québécois was up in the polls, but only by 3%. Still, it looked as if they would win enough close ridings to form a majority, and that's exactly what they did. The Parti Québécois would win 44.8% of the vote, gaining 48 seats for a total of 77 seats. The Liberals would lose 45 seats, now with a total of 47 seats. However, their popular vote was at 44.4%, barely behind the Parti Québécois. Another player in this election, the Democratic Action of Quebec, won 6.5% of the vote, with party leader Mario Dumont being elected. Dumont's ADQ was basically a conservative party which would eventually find its support in traditional conservative ridings. But importantly, he didn't want to identify as a federalist or a sovereigntist. Now, Jacques Parizeau is Premier of Quebec. During the campaign, he stated that if the Parti Québécois was elected, he would hold a referendum on sovereignty in 8 to 10 months. In fact, Parizeau, even though he had a strong background in finance and could probably introduce some meaningful legislation, was almost singularly focused on the sovereignty issue. When he was finance minister under René Lévesque, he really did bring financial reforms that benefited the province, such as providing tax breaks for those who bought stocks in businesses whose head office was in Quebec, as well as government investment in other public utility sectors that helped lower prices. But once he was premier, he was myopically focused on the issue of sovereignty. Less than 3 months after being elected, Parizeau presents his timeline for a referendum on Quebec sovereignty. With the new sovereignty referendum now scheduled for October 30th, 1995, Parizeau put all of his time and effort into the fight. However, there were two problems. The first problem was that Parizeau was a pure technocrat and didn't have any charisma whatsoever. He knew how to read financial reports, but didn't know how to campaign. He lacked charm as well as connecting with the voters. But for Parizeau, the battle wasn't going to be based on charm, but on intellectual arguments. However, this was the same approach that the Parti Québécois took in 1980. Remember when Claude Morin talked about black and white versus technicolor? Yes, the referendum campaign was heading in that direction yet again, and there really wasn't much support for separation immediately. A poll done in February showed that 60% of voters in Quebec would vote no on a referendum to leave Canada. That's the same percentage that no received in 1980. The second blow to Parizeau in the early stages was Lucien Bouchard. On December 1st, 1994, just 5 days before Parizeau was to introduce the intention to call a referendum, Bouchard lost his leg to amputation due to a flesh-eating bacteria that had infected his leg. At first, there were questions as to whether he was going to live. But after 3 months, Bouchard, who was the leader of the official opposition, was back at work in Ottawa. Of course, many considered this good news for the referendum as its charismatic leader was back. But there were other problems. First, Parizeau wanted to be the star of the show, even though his ability to fire up a crowd was as boring as watching paint dry. Parizeau basically wanted to sideline Bouchard and take all the glory for himself. Another issue was that Bouchard thought that Parizeau was going too hard and fast when it came to the referendum. In his first televised interview after losing his leg, Bouchard criticized calling the referendum when it was unpopular, citing the poll that I mentioned earlier. His argument was that people weren't supporting Parizeau's hard sovereigntist option and that changes needed to be made to make the referendum more acceptable to moderate or what we would call soft sovereigntist voters. Another thing to remember about Bouchard is that he was very charismatic even before he lost his leg. Now, after losing his leg, he was almost treated as a saint throughout the province. He stared death in the face, survived, and continued to battle on. He was easily the most revered man in Quebec. Therefore, every day that he was kept on the sideline was another day that Jacques Parizeau missed an opportunity. But Parizeau tried to mitigate the view of a hard separation by bringing in Mario Dumont. Remember, Dumont was the politician that didn't want to take sides, and having him in the Yes campaign could help. Still, sovereignty wasn't getting enough support. Eventually, a change needed to be made. Parizeau decided to hand over the campaign to Lucien Bouchard on October 7th, just 23 days before the vote. Parizeau announced that Bouchard was going to be the chief negotiator for Quebec if the Yes side won the campaign. Not only was the charismatic Bouchard now front and center, but picking Bouchard, who had never been someone who supported a hard separatist approach, would probably negotiate a deal more acceptable and reasonable for Quebec if Yes won. This helped the party's image drastically. Now the polls showed that it was possible for the Yes side to win, with most polls showing the vote within the margin of error. However, even though Parizeau made the promise, he never planned on actually going through with it. Once referendum election day came on October 30th, Parizeau essentially completely cut off Bouchard, with Bouchard not even being able to talk to Parizeau. The reason for this was that if yes won, he, Parizeau, would be the chief negotiator and was going to call for an immediate separation of Quebec from Canada as a completely independent nation, not the sovereignty association that Lévesque talked about in 1980. In fact, Parizeau was so confident of a win, he even recorded a victory speech in both French and English.
My dear friends, Quebec is standing tall. In a majority vote today, the Quebec people has just affirmed to the world that it exists. It is a serene and democratic affirmation, one that no one can ever erase. A strong and simple decision was made today. Quebec will become sovereign.
When the vote came, it was very close. The No campaign won with 50.9% of the vote. After the defeat, both Lucien Bouchard and Jacques Parizeau spoke to their supporters. For Bouchard's speech, it was a very thoughtful speech, which thanked everyone and talked about the future. As for Parizeau, it was a speech that was made out of bitterness and blamed the loss on anyone but himself. He also identified citizens of Quebec as only being francophone. Let me throw in a clip from the documentary The Breaking Point because I think Jean-François Lisée describes it the best way possible.
Hey, si vous voulez, là, on va cesser de parler des francophones du Québec, voulez-vous? On va parler de nous. À 60%, on a voté pour.
I remember I see the press attaché, Marie-Josée Gagnon, and we look at each other like deer in headlights, you know. Wow, this is awful. This is awful. 2/3 of us have voted yes. So he redefines us as francophones, whereas everything we did from the start was to define us as all Quebecers. And then I hear the words about the ethnic votes.
C'est vrai qu'on a été battu, au fond, par quoi? Par l'argent puis des votes ethniques, essentiellement. Alors, ça veut dire que la prochaine fois, au lieu d'être 60 ou 61% à voter oui, on sera 63 ou 64 et ça s'ira. C'est tout.
The next day, Parizeau indicated that he would resign as prime minister in a month. Lucien Bouchard would leave the parliament and the Bloc Québécois to become the leader of the Parti Québécois and thus the new premier of Quebec. And with that, we're going to end the video. Yeah, so that's where I'm going to end the video. And some of you might be saying, Dave, well, the Parti Québécois still exists today. Why aren't you talking about after 1995? Because, you know, you had Pauline Marois with her win and then her loss. You've had a lot of changes in the leaderships and directions and so on. That's true, but to me, the real focus of the party originally was on independence and the independence of Quebec. And to me, it was after that referendum in 1995 where just that talk died. So it was a very important part of the Parti Québécois up till then. But now, and especially in the 21st century, to me, the Parti Québécois has changed. It's gone from that nationalist independent party to a party that is more of a regular political party that's left on economic and social issues, except on social issues which regard secularism. They're very much to the right because they want to go wholly to one side when it comes to secularism. So that to me is a different part. It's not a different party, but it's a different debate. And I wanted to keep this whole entire theme within how not just the party advanced, but how separatism and the sovereignty issue advanced within the party. So that's why we have that break. So that being the video today, thank you all very much. If there are elections that you can think of internationally, overseas, please go ahead and put them below. You might actually be overseas. I'm in the United States. So if you know of any elections where you are from, if you're not from the United States, please go ahead and link them below or just type them or whatever. So thank you all very much. Have a wonderful day wherever it is you are, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.